Section 14 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Anne Boleyn, Chapter 2, Part 3. She received, May 17th, a summons to appear, on the salvation of her soul, in the Archbishop's Court at Lambeth, to answer certain questions as to the validity of her marriage with the king. Henry received a copy of the same summons, but as he had no intentions of being confronted with his unhappy consort, he appeared by his old proctor in divorce affairs, Dr. Sampson. The queen, having no choice in the matter, was compelled to attend in person, though a prisoner under sentence of death. She was conveyed privately from the Tower to Lambeth. The place where this strange scene, in the closing act of Anne Boleyn's tragedy, was performed, was, we are told, a certain low chapel or crypt in Cranmer's house at Lambeth, where, as primate of England, he sat in judgment on the validity of her marriage with the king. The unfortunate queen went through the forms of appointing Doctors Wotton and Barber as her proctors, who, in her name, admitted the pre-contract with Percy, and every other objection that was urged by the king against the legality of the marriage. Wilkin and some others have supposed that Anne submitted to this degradation as the only means of avoiding the terrible sentence of burning. Cranmer pronounced that the marriage between Henry and Anne was null and void, and always had been so. Cromwell was present in his capacity of vicar-general, and Heylin says the sentence was pronounced by him. Thus did Henry take advantage of his former jealous tyranny in preventing the fulfilment of Percy's engagement with Anne, by using it as a pretext against the validity of her marriage with himself, and this too for the sake of illegitimating his own child. With equal injustice and cruelty he denied his conjugal victim the miserable benefit which her degradation from the name of his wife and the rank of his queen appeared to offer her, namely, an escape from the sentence which had been passed upon her for the alleged crime of adultery, to which, if she were not legally his wife, she could not in law be liable. But Henry's vindictive purpose against her was evident from the beginning, and nothing would satisfy him but her blood. If he had insisted on the invalidity of their union as early as May 13th, when Percy was required to answer whether a contract did not exist between him and the queen, Anne could not have been proceeded against on the charges in her indictment, and the lives of the 5 unfortunate men who were previously arraigned and sentenced on the same grounds would have been preserved as well as her own. In that case she could only have been proceeded against as Marchioness of Pembroke, and on a charge of conspiring against the life of the king, but as it does not appear that the slightest evidence tending to establish that very improbable crime was set forth, the blood of 6 victims would have been spared if the sentence on the marriage had passed only 3 days before it did. Percy, however, denied on oath to the Duke of Norfolk, the Lord Chancellor, and others, that any contract was between him and the queen, though he had verbally confessed to Cardinal Wolsey that he was so bound in honour to Anne Boleyn that he could not in conscience marry another woman. It is probable that Anne's haughty spirit, as well as her maternal feelings, had also prompted her to repel the idea of a divorce with scorn till the axe was suspended over her. Perhaps she now submitted, in the hope of preserving not only her own life, but that of her beloved brother, and the 3 gallant and unfortunate gentlemen who had so courageously maintained her innocence through all the terrors and temptations by which they had been beset. If so, how bitter must have been the anguish which rent her heart, when the knell of these devoted victims, swelling gloomily along the banks of the Thames, reached her ears as she returned to her prison, after the unavailing sacrifice of her own and her daughter's rights had been accomplished at Lambeth. That very morning her brother and the other gentlemen were led to execution, a scaffold having been erected for that purpose on Tower Hill. Rochford exhorted his companions to die courageously, and entreated those who came to see him suffer to live according to the gospel, not in preaching but in practice, saying, He would rather have one good liver according to the gospel than 10 babblers. He warned his old companions of the vanity of relying on court favours and the smiles of fortune, which had rendered him forgetful of better things. As a sinner he bewailed his unworthiness, and acknowledged the justice of his punishment in the sight of God, but the king, he said he had never offended, yet he prayed for him that he might have a long and happy life. He forgave all his enemies, and prayed that he might be forgiven by all whom he had injured. Then kneeling down, he calmly submitted his neck to the axe. By some writers it has been regarded as a proof of the queen's guilt that her brother had never attempted to exonerate himself or her from the horrible offence with which they had been branded. But an innocent man might, with equal delicacy and dignity, have been silent on such a subject before such an audience. The accusation, if false, was properly treated with the contempt its grossness merited. There is, however, a reason for Lord Rochford's silence, which has never been adduced by historians. He had made most earnest supplication for his life, and even condescended to entreat the intercession of his unworthy wife with the king to prolong his existence, and as Henry was no less deceitful than cruel, it is possible that he might have tempted Rochford with false hopes to admit the justice of his sentence. General professions of unworthiness and lamentations for sin on the scaffold were customary with persons about to suffer the sentence of the law. Even the spotless and saint-like Lady Jane Grey expresses herself in a similar strain. Therefore, as Sir Henry Ellis observes, no conclusions as to the guilt of the parties accused can reasonably be drawn from such acknowledgments. Norris, Weston, and Brereton, taking their cue from Rochford's form of confession, made general acknowledgments of sinfulness, and requested the bystanders to judge the best of them. Sir Francis Weston was a very beautiful young man, and was so wealthy that his wife and mother offered to purchase his life of the king at the ransom of 100,000 crowns. Henry rejected both the piteous supplication and the bribe. Mark Smeaton, being of ignoble birth, was hanged. He said, "Masters, I pray you all to pray for me, for I have deserved the death." This expression is considered ambiguous, for either he meant that he had committed the crime for which he was to die, or that he merited his punishment for having borne false witness against his royal mistress. It was, however, reported, even at the time, that Mark Smeaton's confession was extorted by the rack, and that he was not confronted with the queen lest he should retract it. Anne evidently expected that he would make the amende on the scaffold, for when she was informed of the particulars of the execution and his last words, she indignantly exclaimed, "Has he not then cleared me from the public shame he hath done me? Alas! I fear his soul will suffer from the false witness he hath borne. My brother and the rest are now, I doubt not, before the face of the greater king, and I shall follow to-morrow." The renewed agony of hope, which had been cruelly and vainly excited in the bosom of the queen by the mockery of declaring that her marriage with the sovereign was null and void, appears soon to have passed away. She had drunk the last drop of bitterness that mingled malice and injustice could infuse into her cup of misery, and when she received the awful intimation that she must prepare herself for death, she met the fiat like one who was weary of a troublesome pilgrimage, and anxious to be released from its sufferings. Such are the sentiments pathetically expressed in the following stanzas, which she is said to have composed after her condemnation, when her poetical talents were employed in singing her own dirge. O death, rock me asleep, bring on my quiet rest. Let pass my very guiltless ghost out of my careful breast. Ring out the doleful knell, let it sound my death tell, for I must die, there is no remedy, for now I die. My pains who can express? Alas, they are so strong! My dolor will not suffer strength my life for to prolong, alone in prison strange. I wail my destiny. Woe worth this cruel hap, that I should taste this misery. Farewell my pleasures past, welcome my present pain. I feel my torment so increase, that life cannot remain. Sound now the passing bell, rung is my doleful knell, for its sound my death doth tell. Death doth draw nigh. Sound the knell dolefully, for now I die." There is an utter abandonment to grief and desolation in these lines which, in their rhythm and cadence, show musical cultivation in the composer. Of a more prosaic nature, yet containing literal truth, as to the events to which they allude, are the verses she wrote after her return from her trial. Defiled is my name, full sore through cruel spite and false report, that I may say for evermore, farewell to joy, adieu comfort. For wrongfully he judge of me, unto my fame a mortal wound. Say what ye list, it may not be, ye seek for that shall not be found. Anne was earnest in preparing herself for death, with many and fervent devotional exercises. And whatever may be said in disparagement by Catholic historians, it is certain that she did not die a Protestant. She passed many hours in private conference with her confessor, and received the sacraments according to the doctrine of transubstantiation. The penance she imposed upon herself for her injurious treatment of her royal stepdaughter, the remembrance of which lay heavily upon her mind, when standing upon the awful verge of eternity, is most interestingly recorded by Speed, who quotes it from the relation of a nobleman. The day before she suffered death, being attended by 6 ladies in the Tower, she took the Lady Kingston into her presence chamber, and there, locking the door upon them, willed her to sit down in the chair of state. Lady Kingston answered, that it was her duty to stand and not to sit at all in her presence, much less upon the seat of state of her the queen. "Ah, madam," replied Anne, "that title is gone. I am a condemned person, and by law have no estate left me in this life but for clearing of my conscience. I pray you sit down." "Well," said Lady Kingston, "I have often played the fool in my youth, and to fulfil your command, I will do it once more in mine age," and thereupon sat down under the cloth of estate on the throne. Then the queen most humbly fell on her knees before her, and holding up her hands with tearful eyes, charged her, as in the presence of God and his angels, and as she would answer to her before them when all should appear to judgment, that she would so fall down before the Lady Mary's Grace, her daughter-in-law, and, in like manner, ask her forgiveness for the wrong she had done her, for, till that was accomplished, she said, her conscience could not be quiet. This fact is also recorded in Kingston's letters to Cromwell, but not so circumstantially as in the account quoted by Speed, from which we learn that Anne Boleyn continued to occupy her own royal apartments in the Tower, with the presence chamber and canopied chair of state, commonly called the Queen's lodgings, and that she had the free range of them, even after the warrant for her execution was signed, although tradition points out more than one dismal tower of the royal fortress as the place of her imprisonment. The queen was ordered for execution on the 19th of May, and it was decreed by Henry that she should be beheaded on the green within the Tower. It was a case without precedent in the annals of England, for never before had female blood been shed on the scaffold. Even in the Norman reigns of terror, woman's life had been held sacred, and the most merciless of the Plantagenet sovereigns had been too manly, under any provocation or pretense, to butcher ladies. But the age of chivalry was over, and not one spark of its ennobling spirit lingered in the breast of the sensual tyrant, who gave the first example of sending queens and princesses to the block, like sheep to the shambles. Perhaps there were moments when the lovely and once passionately beloved Anne Boleyn doubted the possibility of his consigning her to the sword of the executioner. That Henry was aware that his doing so would be an outrage on public decency is certain by his ordering all strangers to be expelled from the Tower. There is an expression in Kingston's letter which implies that a rescue was apprehended. At any rate, the experiment was yet to be tried, how Englishmen could brook the spectacle of seeing their beautiful queen mangled by a foreign headsman, that the sovereign might be at liberty to bestow her place on her handmaid. As it was the king's pleasure that his conjugal victim should be decollated with a sword, after the French manner of execution, the headsman of Calais was brought over to England for the purpose, a man who was considered remarkably expert at his horrible calling. The unfortunate queen was duly apprised of this circumstance, with the other preparations for the last act of the tragedy that was to terminate her brilliant but fatal career. She had had mournful experience of the vanity and vexation of all the distinctions that had flattered her. Beauty, wealth, genius, pleasure, power, royalty, had all been hers, and whither had they led her? On Friday, the 19th of May, the last sad morning of her life, Anne rose 2 hours after midnight, and resumed her devotions with her almoner. Her previous desire of having the consecrated elements remain in her closet, which in such case is always for the purposes of adoration, and the fact that she termed the sacrament the good Lord, proves plainly that she did not die a Protestant. When she was about to receive the sacrament, she sent for Sir William Kingston, that he might be a witness of her last solemn protestation of her innocence of the crimes for which she was sentenced to die, before she became a partaker of the holy rite. It is difficult to imagine any person wantonly provoking the wrath of God by incurring the crime of perjury at such a moment. She had evidently no hope of prolonging her life, and appeared not only resigned to die, but impatient of the unexpected delay of an hour or two before the closing scene was to take place. This delay was caused by the misgivings of Henry, for Kingston had advised Cromwell not to fix the hour for the execution, so that it could be exactly known when it was to take place, lest it should draw an influx of spectators from the city. It does not appear that Anne condescended to implore the mercy of the king. In her letter of the 6th of May, she had appealed to his justice, and reminded him that he must hereafter expect to be called to a strict account for his treatment of her if he took away her life on false and slanderous pretenses. But there is no record that she caused a single supplication to be addressed to him in her behalf. She knew his pitiless nature too well even to make the attempt to touch his feelings after the horrible imputations with which he had branded her, and this lofty spirit looks like the pride of innocence and the bitterness of a deeply wounded mind. While Kingston was writing his last report to Cromwell of her preparations for the awful change that awaited her, she sent for him and said, "Mr. Kingston, I hear I shall not die afore noon, and I am very sorry therefore, for I thought to be dead by this time, and past my pain." I told her, says Kingston, that the pain should be little, it was so subtle, and then she said, "I have heard say the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck," and put her hands about it, laughing heartily. "I have seen men and also women executed, and they have been in great sorrow," continues the lieutenant of the Tower, "but, to my knowledge, this lady hath much joy and pleasure in death. Sir, her almoner is continually with her, and hath been since 2 o'clock after midnight." There must have been one powerful tie to bind the hapless queen to a world from which she appeared eager to be released. She was a mother, and was leaving her infant daughter to the domination of the treacherous beauty who was to take her place in Henry's state, as she had already done in his fickle fancy, and Anne Boleyn had no reason to expect that Jane Seymour would prove a kinder stepdame to Elisabeth than she had done to the Princess Mary, an agonizing thought in the hour of death. It is not known whether Anne requested to see her little one, who was quite old enough to know her and to return her caresses, for Elisabeth was at the attractive age of 2 years and 8 months, but if the unfortunate queen preferred such a petition, it was fruitless, and she was led to the scaffold without being permitted to bestow a parting embrace on her child. Perhaps she felt that such an interview would unfit her for acting her part in the last trying scene that awaited her with the lofty composure which its publicity required. That great historian, Lord Bacon, assures us that Queen Anne protested her innocence with undaunted greatness of mind at the time of her death. He tells us, that by a messenger, faithful and generous as she supposed, who was one of the king's privy chamber, she, just before she went to execution, sent this message to the king: "Commend me to his majesty, and tell him he hath been ever constant in his career of advancing me. From a private gentlewoman he made me a marchioness, from a marchioness a queen, and now he hath left no higher degree of honour, he gives my innocency the crown of martyrdom. But the messenger durst not carry this to the king, then absorbed in a new passion, yet tradition has truly transmitted it to posterity. This sarcastic message is noted as a memorandum on the letter which Anne wrote to Henry from the Tower, probably by Cromwell or his secretary, and it has frequently been quoted by historians. But Lord Bacon is the only person who places it in its apparently true chronology, the day of her death, when hope was gone, and the overcharged heart of the victim dared to give vent to its last bitterness in those memorable words. The time appointed by Henry for the execution of his unhappy consort was 12 o'clock at noon. This was kept a profound mystery from the people till the time was at hand. A few minutes before that hour, the fatal portals through which the royal victim was to pass for the last time were open, and she appeared dressed in a robe of black damask, with a deep white cape falling over it on her neck. She wore the pointed black velvet hood, which is familiar to us in her portraits, or, as some have said, a small hat with ornamented coifs under it. Perhaps the picturesque bangled hat, which forms part of the costume of her statue at Blickling Hall. The feverish state of excited feeling in which she had passed the morning vigil had probably recalled the brightness to her eye and a flush to her cheek, which supplied the loss of her faded bloom, for she is said to have come forth in fearful beauty. Indeed, one writer says, "Never had the queen looked so beautiful before." She was led by the lieutenant of the Tower, and attended by the 4 maids of honour who had waited upon her in prison. She was conducted by Sir William Kingston to the scaffold, which was erected on the green before the church of St. Peter ad Vincula. Having been assisted by Sir William to ascend the steps to the platform, she there saw assembled the Lord Mayor, and some of the civic dignitaries, and her great enemy, the Duke of Suffolk, with Henry's natural son, the Duke of Richmond, who had, in defiance of all decency and humanity, come thither to disturb her last moments with their unfriendly espionage, and to feast their eyes upon her blood. There also was the ungrateful blacksmith's secretary of state, Cromwell, who, though he had been chiefly indebted to her patronage for his present greatness, had shown no disposition to succour her in her adversity. The fact was, his son and heir was married to the sister of Jane Seymour, Henry's bride-elect, and the climbing parvenu was one of the parties most interested in the fall of Queen Anne, and affixing the stigma of illegitimacy on her daughter, for the advancement of his family connection to the throne. Anne must have been perfectly aware of his motives, but she accorded him and the other reptilia of the Privy Council the mercy of her silence when she met them on the scaffold. She came there, as she with true dignity observed, to die and not to accuse her enemies. When she had looked round her, she turned to Kingston and entreated him not to hasten the signal for her death till she had spoken that which was on her mind to say, to which he consented, and then she spoke. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to law, for by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused, as I know full well that aught that I could say in my defence doth not appertain unto you, and that I could draw no hope of life from the same. But I come here only to die, and thus to yield myself humbly unto the will of my lord the king. I pray God to save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler or more merciful prince was there never. To me he was ever a good and gentle sovereign. If any person will meddle with my cause, I require them to judge the best. Thus I take my leave of the world and of you, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me." She then with her own hands removed the hat and collar, which might impede the action of the sword, and taking the coifs from her head, delivered them to one of her ladies. Then covering her hair with a little linen cap, for it seems as if her ladies were too much overpowered with grief and terror to assist her, and that she was the only person who retained her composure, she said, "Alas, my poor head, in a very brief space thou wilt roll in the dust on the scaffold, and as in life thou didst not merit to wear the crown of a queen, so in death thou deservest not better doom than this." All present were then in tears, save the base court sycophants, who came to flatter the evil passions of the sovereign. Anne took leave of her weeping ladies in these pathetic words: "And ye, my damsels, who, whilst I lived, ever showed yourselves so diligent in my service, and who are now to be present at my last hour and mortal agony, as in good fortune ye were faithful to me, so even at this my miserable death ye do not forsake me. And as I cannot reward you for your true service to me, I pray you take comfort for my loss. Howbeit, forget me not, and be always faithful to the king's grace, and to her whom, with happier fortune, ye may have as your queen and mistress. And esteem your honour far beyond your life, and, in your prayers to the Lord Jesu, forget not to pray for my soul." Among these last true followers of the unfortunate queen was the companion of her childhood, Mistress Mary Wyatt, Sir Thomas Wyatt's sister, who, faithful through every reverse, attended her on the scaffold. To this tried friend Anne Boleyn gave, as a parting gift, her last possession, a little book of devotions, bound in gold and enamelled black, which she had held in her hand from the time she left her apartment in the Tower till she commenced her preparations for the block. Mary always wore this precious relic in her bosom. Some mysterious last words, supposed to be a message to Sir Thomas Wyatt, the queen was observed to whisper very earnestly to Mrs. Mary Wyatt before she knelt down. It has been said that Anne refused to allow her eyes to be covered, and that, whenever the executioner approached her, his purpose was disarmed by his encountering their brilliant glances, till, taking off his shoes, he beckoned to one of the assistants to advance on one side as he softly approached on the other, and when the queen, deceived by this subterfuge, turned her eyes in the direction whence she heard the steps, he struck her head off with one blow of the Calais sword. The account given by the Portuguese Spectator of this mournful scene is as follows: "And being minded to say no more, she knelt down upon both knees, and one of her ladies covered her eyes with a bandage, and then they withdrew themselves some little space, and knelt down over against the scaffold, bewailing bitterly and shedding many tears. And thus, and without more to say or do, was her head struck off, she making no confession of her fault, but saying, 'O Lord God, have pity on my soul.' This being the record of an eye-witness, we think it is deserving of credit, and it agrees with the dignified composure of Anne's behaviour on the scaffold. Gratian says she died with great resolution, and so sedately as to cover her feet with her garments, in like manner as the Roman poet records of the royal Polyxena, when about to be sacrificed at the tomb of Achilles. According to another authority, her last words were, 'In manus tuas.' The bloody blow came down from his trembling hand who gave it, says Wyatt, when those about her could not but seem to themselves to have received it upon their own necks, she not so much as shrinking at it." Spelman has noted that Anne Boleyn's eyes and lips were observed to move when her head was held up by the executioner. It is also said that before those beautiful eyes sunk in the dimness of death, they seemed for an instant mournfully to regard her bleeding body as it fell on the scaffold. It does not appear that the last moments of Anne were disturbed by the presence of Lady Boleyn and Mrs. Cousins. The gentler females who, like ministering angels, had followed their royal mistress to her doleful prison and dishonouring scaffold, half fainting and drowned in tears as they were, surrounded her mangled remains, now a spectacle appalling to woman's eyes. Yet they would not abandon them to the ruffian hands of the executioner and his assistants, but, with unavailing tenderness, washed away the blood from the lovely face and glossy hair, that scarcely 3 years before had been proudly decorated with the crown of St. Edward, and now but for these unbought offices of faithful love would have been lying neglected in the dust. Our Portuguese authority informs us that one weeping lady took the severed head, the others the bleeding body of the unfortunate queen, and, having reverently covered them with a sheet, placed them in a chest which there stood ready, and carried them to the church, which is within the Tower, where," he continues, "they say she lieth buried with the others," meaning by her fellow victims, who had 2 days before preceded her to the scaffold. There is, however, some reason to doubt whether the mangled remains of this hapless queen repose in the place generally pointed out in St. Peter's Church of the Tower as the spot where she was interred. It is true that her warm and almost palpitating form was there conveyed in no better coffin than an old elm chest that had been used for keeping arrows, and there, in less than half an hour after the executioner had performed his part, thrust into a grave that had been prepared for her by the side of her murdered brother. And there she was interred, without other obsequies than the whispered prayers and choking sobs of those true-hearted ladies who had attended her on the scaffold, and were the sole mourners who followed her to the grave. It is to be lamented that history has only preserved one name out of this gentle sisterhood, that of Mary Wyatt, when all were worthy to have been inscribed in golden characters in every page sacred to female tenderness and charity. In Anne Boleyn's native county, Norfolk, a curious tradition has been handed down from father to son for upwards of 3 centuries, which affirms that her remains were secretly removed from the Tower Church under cover of darkness, and privately conveyed to Sale Church, the ancient burial place of the Boleyns, and there interred at midnight, with the holy rites that were denied to her by her royal husband at her first unhallowed funeral. A plain black marble slab, without any inscription, is still shown in Sale Church as a monumental memorial of this queen, and is generally supposed, by all classes of persons in that neighbourhood, to cover her remains. The mysterious sentence with which Wyatt closes his eloquent memorial of the death of this unfortunate queen affords a singular confirmation of the local tradition of her removal and reinterment. God, he says, provided for her corpse sacred burial, even in a place as it were consecrated to innocence. This expression would lead us to infer that Wyatt was in the secret, if not one of the parties who assisted in the exhumation of Anne Boleyn's remains, if the romantic tradition we have repeated be, indeed, based on facts. After all, there is nothing to violate probability in the tale, romantic though it be. King Henry, on the day of his queen's execution, tarried no longer in the vicinity of his metropolis than till the report of the signal gun, booming faintly through the forest glen, reached his ear, and announced the joyful tidings that he had been made a widower. He then rode off at fiery speed to his bridal orgies at Wolf Hall. With him went the confidential myrmidons of his council, caring little, in their haste to offer their homage to the queen of the morrow, whether the mangled remains of the queen of yesterday were securely guarded in the dishonoured grave into which they had been thrust, with indecent haste, that noon. There was neither singing nor saying for her, no chapel ardente nor midnight requiem, as for other queens, and in the absence of these solemnities, it was easy for her father, for Wyatt, or even for his sister, to bribe the porter and sextons to the church, to connive at the removal of the royal victim. That old elm chest would excite no suspicion, when carried through the dark narrow streets and the Aldgate portal of the city to the eastern road. It probably passed as a coffer of stores for the country, no one imagining that such a receptacle enclosed the earthly relics of their crowned and anointed queen. It is remarkable that in the ancient church of Hordon on the Hill, in Essex, a nameless black marble monument is also pointed out by village antiquaries as the veritable monument of this queen. The existence of a similar tradition of the kind in 2 different counties, but in both instances in the neighbourhood of Sir Thomas Boleyn's estates, can only be accounted for on the supposition that rumours of the murdered queen's removal from the Tower Chapel were at one time in circulation among the tenants and dependents of her paternal house, and were by them orally transmitted to their descendants as matter of fact. Historical traditions are, however, seldom devoid of some kind of foundation, and whatever be their discrepancies, they frequently afford a shadowy evidence of real but unrecorded events, which, if steadily investigated, would lend a clue, whereby things of great interest might be traced. A great epic poet of our times has finely said, "Tradition, O tradition, thou of the seraph tongue, the arc that links 2 ages, the ancient and the young." The execution of the Viscount Rochford rendered his 2 sisters the co-heiresses of their father, the Earl of Wiltshire. The attainder of Anne Boleyn, together with Cranmer's sentence on the nullity of her marriage with the king, had, by the law of the land, deprived her and her issue of any claim on the inheritance of her father, yet, on the death of the Earl of Wiltshire, King Henry, in defiance of his own acts, did, with equal rapacity and injustice, seize Hever Castle and other portions of the Boleyn patrimony in right of his divorced and murdered wife Anne, the elder daughter, reserving for her daughter Elisabeth all that Mary Boleyn and her heirs could otherwise have claimed. Greenwich Palace was Anne Boleyn's favourite abode of all the royal residences. The park is planted and laid out in the same style as her native Blickling, and with the same kind of trees. It is natural to suppose that the noble intersected arcades of chestnuts, which form the principal charm of the royal park, were planted under the direction of this queen, in memory of those richer and more luxuriant groves beneath whose blossom branches she sported her careless childhood with her sister Mary, her poet brother Rochford, and her poet lover Wyatt. Happy would it have been for Anne Boleyn if parental ambition had never aimed at her fulfilling a higher destiny than becoming the wife of an accomplished and true-hearted Wyatt, that devoted friend, whose love, surviving the grave, still lives in the valuable biographical memorials which he preserved of her life. Sir Thomas Wyatt died 4 years after the execution of Anne Boleyn. Percy only survived her a few months. The motives for Anne's destruction were so glaringly unveiled by the indecorous and inhuman haste with which the king's marriage with Jane Seymour was celebrated, that a strong presumption of her innocence has naturally been the result with unprejudiced readers. André Thevet, a Franciscan, affirms that he was assured by several English gentlemen that Henry VIII, on his deathbed, expressed peculiar remorse for the wrong he had done Anne Boleyn by putting her to death on a false accusation. The Franciscans, as a body, had suffered so much for their steadfast support of the cause of Queen Catharine, in opposition to the rival interests of Queen Anne, that a testimony in favour of the latter, from one of that order, ought to be regarded as impartial history. Anne Boleyn must have been in her 36th year at the time of her execution, for Cavendish tells us that her brother, Lord Rochford, was 27 when he was appointed of the king's privy chamber. This was in 1527. The queen was probably about a year younger. This would have made her 14 when she went to France as maid of honour to the bride of Louis XII, and 32 at the time of her acknowledged marriage with the king. She had been maid of honour to 4 queens, namely, Mary and Claude, queens of France, Margaret, queen of Navarre, and Catherine of Aragon, the first consort of Henry VIII, whom, in an evil hour for both, she supplanted in the affections of the king, and succeeded in her royal dignity as Queen of England. She only survived the broken-hearted Catherine 4 months and a few days. It is necessary to notice that since the publication of the first edition of this volume, it has been asserted in some of the periodicals and papers of the day that the guilt of Anne Boleyn has been proved by the documents recently mentioned in the report of the Record Commission, relative to the contents of Baga de Secretis. This bag, which was always known to be in existence, contains not, as some persons have erroneously stated, the evidences of Anne Boleyn's trial, but merely the indictment, precepts, and conviction of that unfortunate queen, and not a tittle of the evidence produced in substantiation of the revolting crimes with which she was charged. It is therefore a negative proof of her innocence that these should have been preserved and the latter destroyed. It has hitherto been suspected that the evidence was destroyed by the order of Queen Elizabeth, but surely if she had destroyed the evidence, she would never have permitted the indictment to remain, which branded the name of her unhappy mother as a monster of impurity. It stands to reason that Henry and his council, being aware that no evidence of Anne's guilt was produced, that would bear a dispassionate legal examination, took effectual measures to prevent its ever appearing in her justification. If Elizabeth had known of the existence of the indictment, she would have destroyed it without a doubt. End of section 14.